Imagine that you're a 23-year-old public school orchestra teacher. Your day job consists of teaching middle schoolers, 7th grade. You're a first-year teacher. One day, someone calls you up on the phone and they say, "Hey, I heard you're a pretty decent orchestra teacher. Would you be interested in teaching a group of female prison inmates, an orchestra for female prison inmates?" What would be your answer to that question? Well, I can tell you this very teaching opportunity actually fell into my lap. It was the fall of 2004 at the Hiland Mountain Correctional Center in Eagle River, Alaska. And my answer that day was yes. It was a slightly terrified yes, but it was a yes, because that was just the most unique thing I'd ever heard of. A couple of weeks later, I was driving up the long road leading to the jail. It was the first day of class, and a couple of things were going through my mind. And the first of which was actually, ironically, the same thing that I thought on the first day of teaching the 7th grade, which was, I really hope that they like me. And that just seems like a strange thing to say, right? That you want a group of convicts just to like you. But anybody who's ever been a first-year teacher knows that feeling, I think. And then the other thing I was thinking was, will this orchestra make a difference? There was a cellist who actually lived during the last century. His name was Pablo Casals, and he was this great humanitarian. And Casals once proposed the idea that music would change the world. And I remember thinking on that drive, but did Pablo Casals ever teach the cello at a place like Hiland? Was that the world? And what made these women worth saving, if you could even do such a thing with music? When I entered the parking lot of the jail that day, I remember thinking what a contradiction this place is, because you have this beautiful Alaskan backdrop, and then the juxtaposition of the barbed wire and the fences. I went into the building and I was led in by a guard. He carefully searched my violin and he took me through the airlock doors. We went down the hallway. We went to my classroom. And I opened the door, and there waiting for me was 8 students. Now I have to say, apart from their outfits and the obvious setting, they really appeared like your average group of Alaskan women. And as I got to working with them, I remember being so shocked at how well-spoken and polite and interested they were in what I was teaching. But the greatest relief of all came that day when I realized how easily they laughed. They never ceased to find the humor in what we were attempting and what we sounded like, because we didn't sound that great back then, especially in the beginning. But they always had fun with it, and that made them so easy to teach. It wasn't until actually quite some time later that I found out why they were in prison. Unbeknownst to me, my little beginning class consisted of a kidnapper, a woman who had set her house on fire, which resulted in the death of her mom, and 5 murderers. And I just remember thinking, how could that be? Because these are people that I genuinely really like hanging out with every week. And I was grateful that music brought us together and united us, and that's what we focused on, because the rest of it was really mind-boggling to even hear about. In terms of our circumstances, we had vast differences. The biggest difference being that I could come and go from the prison while they had to stay there. And I could see my family every night, whereas some of them, they hadn't seen their families in decades. But it was not only these big differences that seemed to take a toll on them after a while, it was like all the little things too. I remember one time my concert master came into rehearsal, and she just casually mentioned to me, "You know, I can't wait till the day when I can eat my lunch without a spork." And I said, "What are you talking about?" And she said, "Well, you know, I've been in here since I was 18, and I'm 47 now. And in all that time, I've never eaten a meal with a metal knife or fork. And then she described to me her procedure for cutting chicken with a wooden ruler, because you have to be resourceful in prison. And as the next 10 years passed, my life, it went through all the typical milestones that one's life does. I had a career, a marriage, a baby. And some of my students at Hiland, they were there the whole time. And it seemed like in some ways they were kind of running in place. Some of them had never used a cell phone. Some of them had never seen an iPod. I remember just last month, someone was joking in class about hashtags. And I thought, hashtags? How do you guys know about this? Probably a third of you have never really been on the internet. But I think that they see things in the media and they joke about it because they just want to feel normal, like anybody else. But in terms of the rehearsals, at least, we were succeeding. And so it became clear that the first big hurdle for the orchestra was going to be in fundraising so that we could sustain the group for the long term. And it was decided the best way to do this was actually to have the women raise the money themselves. By putting on a concert, tickets would be sold, and all the proceeds would benefit the orchestra, because the orchestra has never been funded through taxpayer money. And of course, there's the big catch, right? That the women, they can't leave the jail. And so we had to bring the audience to them. And luckily, that administration at Hiland is so progressive. They always have been. And they said, you know, we're going to figure out a way to make this work because this is a really unique program. So 50 tickets were sold, and background checks were conducted on all of the audience members, and the date was set. And I remember the women were both simultaneously terrified but also excited about this performance opportunity. I think the terror came in what we sounded like at that time, because we were just beginners and people were going to pay to see us play. And also, as this woman put it to me, she said, I feel so vulnerable because in these sorts of public situations, I'm always wondering if I'm going to be judged on the mistakes of my past or on this future that I'm trying to embrace. And that was kind of the big question. So the big day came, and this is a photograph of that original group that performed that day, only they ditched those prison jumpsuits for concert black. And I remember the performance itself was kind of rough, technically speaking. There was a reporter there from a local newspaper who said something along the lines of they had pretty much butchered a Bach minuet. And I don't disagree with that assessment, you know, because we were a beginning orchestra. We couldn't be something that we weren't. That's what we were. And I do have to say, though, after they finished the final note, that audience rose to their feet. And they gave them a huge ovation because they got the big picture that day. If they had walked into the concert and recognized a woman's name in the program from something that they, you know, heard in the media, I know that they left the concert thinking of her as being something a little bit more than just a convict. And I know that the women, they most definitely felt that way about themselves, as being something just a little bit more for a couple of hours. They relished the memory of that performance, and they couldn't wait to see what was next for us. So the next big hurdle was in recruiting more members, because obviously 8 people or less does not make an orchestra, not even close. And this was something that I have to say I failed at for a period of several years. It was the hardest thing I ever had to do at Hiland. And I remember going home to my husband one night and complaining to him and saying, honey, you know, I only got like 8 people in this group, and I can't get people to take a gamble on my class. No one will sign up. And then a couple of weeks later, I went back to him and I said, you know, I got a couple people to sign up and they quit after like 1 week. I can't get them to stick with it. And he looked at me sympathetically, because he too is a music teacher, and he said, you know, you have to think about where you're teaching. They're in prison. Think about where you're teaching. And I thought about it, and part of him was kind of right, because if you look at prison statistics in the United States of America, 95% of inmates that are incarcerated today are going to get out at some point during their lifetime. 95%. But of that 95%, 2/3 reoffend and get sent back to jail because they can't stick with it. It's called recidivism. And, you know, he had a point, because my students say to me all the time, I've never finished anything from beginning to end. I have never fully completed anything in my whole life from start to finish. And I think what I was experiencing was just a microcosm of the overall problem. So a couple of weeks later, I ended up going out to lunch with my good friend, Patty Crowfoot. Now, Patty Crowfoot, she's a phenomenal woman in Anchorage. She's an accountant, she's an amateur cellist, and 10 years ago, she was looking around for an orchestra that she could just play classical music with for fun. And she knew the Anchorage Symphony was way out of her league. She didn't really want to play with the kids group all the time, and so she kind of came up empty-handed. But she had this friend who worked out at Hiland, and her name was Janice Weiss. And Janice said, hey, Patty, you know this orchestra that you've been searching for? Have you thought about starting it out at the jail? And so she did. And 10 years later, I have to say that Patty is still one of our most dedicated members. She comes almost every Saturday to play with us. And not only does Patty come, but she has brought her friends. Now, think about it. This is a group of Anchorage citizens who couldn't find the music to feed their soul on the outside, but they find it every week in a prison. And it sounds bizarre, but it's a very inspiring way to spend your Saturdays. So Patty said all these years ago, you know what your problem is? Because I was telling her, you know, everybody's quitting. She said, you need to try and corral the power of the inmates, because that's where the power is. The power is not with you, the teacher, because, you know, students are best motivated by other students. So I thought about that, and I decided to change my tactics. I took those original 8 members and I made them my mentors. And those mentors, they went trolling for new recruits all the time because they knew everybody who lived there. I didn't know everybody. And they also would have great levels of excitement if they could find a long-term inmate, because that meant somebody who could potentially devote a lot of time to playing an instrument too. And so this started to build on itself over a period of time. And today we have between 30 and 40 members in the orchestra at any given time. Not only have the numbers improved, but also the quality of the concerts. Because a while back, we started writing letters to famous soloists from around the US, from around Alaska, and we just asked them, hey, would you be interested in coming to solo with our prison orchestra for our fundraising concert in a prison gym? And strangely enough, no one has turned us down yet. An example of this would be cellist Zool Bailey. He came in 2012. And jazz violinist Diane Monroe, who came in 2013 from Philadelphia. And so many others. And sometimes these guys wanted to play music that was way beyond what we could handle. And so I called my friends up in the Anchorage Symphony and I said, hey, would you come out and play with us? Come help us with this music. And they did. And so the visual at the concerts is really stunning, because you can't discern the inmate musicians from the community musicians. They're all dressed in concert black. And we're all just united in music. And I think ultimately I learned that day that it really does take a village of people to build a prison orchestra, and not just the efforts of one person. So what is the bottom line? Did a prison orchestra actually help aid in the recovery or reduce the recidivism rates of its inmates? Well, I have to say, in terms of recidivism, we don't know, because we don't keep track of that sort of thing. But I do know one thing for sure. Over the past 10 years, I've observed the journey of many incarcerated women. And when they first come to jail, they're oftentimes in disarray. Sometimes they can be very fragile. But some of them choose to join the orchestra. And in doing so, they become musicians, bit by bit. Now, a musician is a person who knows when to lead. And a musician is a person who knows when to follow. And a musician is a person who knows that the group is the most important thing, not the individual. Now, I firmly understand and believe that prisons, they do have to have structure and discipline and boundaries in order to function successfully, but they also have to have that element of humanity. Because if you don't have humanity, how can inmates be expected to behave humanely on the outside when perhaps some of them have never seen that demonstrated before in their lives? And when I think back to those 10 years ago, when I asked myself, are these women worth saving? I think the answer is ultimately yes, because 95% of them will walk amongst us again. And that's the genius thing about the Hiland prison, is that it's not just the orchestra program there, where they have people interacting with the community. It's so many of the programs that they offer. It has the women mixing it up with the world, because they got it there, that the best way to teach humanity is by having inmates interact with phenomenal humans. Because their recovery is our recovery, and their future is our future. Thank you.